Thank you very much for that. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers, RIETI, Gakuin, and Hitotsubatsu University, for giving me this opportunity to share my ideas with you, with this audience. And I'm very much looking forward to your questions, although experience suggests that when an audience is as prestigious and knowledgeable as this audience, the questions tend to be comments. And everybody's better off for that. So please, looking forward to your remarks as well. Now, the topic is supply chains and productivity. It's, of course, tempting to throw away the slides and just talk about geopolitics at this moment, but that would be unfair to the translators. So I'm going to stick to my slides. Let me start with the basic economics, which is an excuse for the things that I'm not going to talk about. The basic economics of supply chain and productivity are rather easy. The gains from trade traditionally are taught as showing up in higher utility. If the gains from trade are within the production process, then the gains show up as higher productivity. So internationalization, global supply chains, all the reasons we thought they were good because it was good for utility, will, when those prices and quantities and qualities show up inside the production process, will show up as productivity. So what I'm going to be talking about is the global value chains and their evolution, not the productivity effects thereof. That's what we've been talking about for the last 2 days. So there's, of course, the standard gains from trade, standard comparative advantage. Things are made where they're more appropriately made in terms of factor endowments, and also there's scale economies and varieties that come from concentrating, and also from agglomeration, grouping things together, and the knowledge, the know-how sharing that goes through supply chains. So those are all the sources of the connections between global value chains or global supply chains and productivity. Now, what I want to do is lay out some baseline macro facts about supply chains. Many of the people in this room will be very familiar with them, but they're absolutely critical in understanding what's going on, and it's something quite different. So first of all, the G7 deindustrialized and 6 emerging economies industrialized. The rest of the world didn't change. So there has been a radical transformation of manufacturing. And of course, we're talking about manufacturing supply chains here. And what you see is back in 1999, the G7 had about 2/3 of all manufacturing. And this I6, China, India, Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, and Brazil, most of all China, they only had about 10%. And between 2000 and the late 2000s and 10s, those two curves switch places. So the G7 lost world shares, the I6 gained world shares, and then from about the middle of the 2010s, that switch leveled out. Now, what's other things striking and is very revealing of what's going on is that black line, which is the other 150 countries, did not change. The world did not change. So what happened was very specific, involving relatively few number of countries, but above all China, as we'll see. So here's China dominates manufacturing. I'm going to show it in gross output, but more or less the same story is true in value added or number of workers or exports or however you want to measure it. So if you look at the left chart, this is China's share, the red, and the other top 10 countries. And as you can see now, China's gross output is larger than the next 9 countries put together. So China is absolutely dominant in the world of manufacturing now, in the way it probably never has been, maybe since the Industrial Revolution. And that simple fact dictates many, many things that are going on in the world today, and it dictates many facts about the evolution of global value chains. In particular, you cannot talk about global value chains without special casing China. So the right chart shows the same thing for the red, and it shows the decline of all the other G7. China also now dominates global supply chains. So this is from I'm going to look at intermediates versus final goods distinction, arguing that it's very important to look at the intermediate impacts, the intermediate goods that China produces, not just the final goods that we're all so familiar with electronic gadgets and whatever, because global value chains are all about intermediate goods. Now, this is from a paper, a Brookings paper that I did 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, where we used a look-through measure of the source of the intermediates. So we don't just look at the trade data, where did, for example, the US import its intermediates from. We looked at the Chinese import content of, for example, US imports from Canada, all the way down the chain. So we call that foreign producer exposure import side, FPEM. And as you can see, this graph goes from 1995 to 2020. As you can see, the US's reliance, on China, that's the red line, has been rising and is now pretty high. It's the highest in the world by far. China's reliance on the US is the blue line, and you can see it's relatively lower, although it started higher, and it's declining. And the same is true of the other manufacturing giants, Germany, Japan, and in fact, it's true of basically every major manufacturing country in the world has seen the same pattern, an increasing reliance on Chinese industrial inputs while China's reliance on theirs falls. Now, I will skip this one. It's about why China is closing, because I have too many slides already. So now, how and why is world manufacturing trade ratio peaked around 2008? And just to save slides, and presuming many of you know, the world trade went up to 2008, it peaked, and it's declined since. That's trade in goods, including trade in manufactured goods. So I want to look at why that's true, and I want to focus on two things: defragmentation and relocalization. Or another way to say that is supply chains are retrenching and relocalizing. Those are two very separate things. So why did manufacturing trade peak? If you read the news sources, you hear geopolitics all the time. Geopolitics is leading to fragmentation. The IMF has studies on it. People are more or less dating it to when this geopolitics starts, often 2016. Or is the global value chain revolution going in reverse? So my hypothesis is it's a global value chain in reverse, and mostly technological reasons, not geopolitical. So the first of all is defragmentation. The supply chains are defragmenting and relocating. So defragmentation of the manufacturing process due to information technology. I'm going to go through a little bit of explaining as to why this is happening. So this is, if you want, the argument in a sequence of pictures. So if you look at the left picture, that's a picture of the Ford factory, the original one at River Rouge, where there was no fragmentation. Absolutely everything was done inside the factory. And for example, since he needed rubber from Brazil, he bought the farms in Brazil as well, and the ships that it was shipped on. There was basically no fragmentation whatsoever. Now, the middle, that's a Saab car, and you can see the parts and components are coming from all over the place and assembled in Sweden. And the right is, let's say, in the very future, where it's 3D printing, it will once again all be done in one factory. So my story is that it was concentrated before ICT made it possible to fragment it. Then it fragmented, and technology is making it no longer worthwhile fragmenting, so it's relocalizing and defragmenting. So how I'm going to measure fragmentation? It's what I call the global fragmentation ratio, and it's the ratio of the value of industrial intermediates in the world, domestic, foreign, whatever, over the value of gross production all over the world in manufacturing. So it's the share, essentially, of gross output that is in intermediate goods. It's a measure of production process, not internationalization. So this is what it looks like. From 1995 to 2013, manufacturing fragmented. As you can see, it went up. From 2013 to 2020, it defragmented. And it's most important to note that this was way before Brexit, way before the Trump season one, And way before, a lot of the tensions with China were headlines. It's my argument that a lot of what's going on now is technological and confused with geopolitics. Not to say that geopolitics isn't important. So if you special case China, at least when it comes to the left chart, which is, or would be right chart, is manufacturing of intermediates over total production. The blue is the world, and the red, the orange, is the world without China. And the reason is China is not defragmenting as much because their comparative advantage in intermediates is shifting more of the world's intermediate production to China. So it's less than that. The right chart is manufacturing intermediates imported over all intermediate usage. So it's about internationalization. And there you can see that the world as a whole, which is blue, has peaked and is now going down. In fact, it's back to the level it was before. But if you take China out of that, everybody's still relying more and more on intermediate inputs. That's the incredibly large role of China in there. So now let me talk about, well, I'll just say what's on this slide. This is fragmentation by sector. And in the manufacturing sector, every single subsector of manufacturing has the same pattern of increasing fragmentation, then decreasing fragmentation. That was an eye test for you guys. So why fragment and then defragment? My story is that it's the ICT revolution, which is what, because I'm slightly dyslexic, I wrote as the ITC revolution, but there we go. ICT is a double-edged sword. And this is a story that Nicholas Bloom has told quite a long time ago. Think about it as CT for communication technology and IT for information technology. So my hypothesis is that communication and coordination technology lowers the marginal cost of coordinating more stages of production. Information technology lowers the marginal benefit of having more specialized stages. So at first, ICT was mostly about the communication, and so it led to a fragmentation because it was easier to do so. Later, the automation essentially put more tasks into a single machine and therefore made it less important to have lots of stages so that they'd be specialized. That's my story. CT fragments, IT defragments. CT came down faster at first. Then IT is coming down faster with industrial automation now. That's my story. I'll show you some charts. So how did CT fragment factories? This is a framework I put up 10 years ago or something. I call it the task, occupation, stages, and product framework. So think about the production process as having tasks up at the top there. Now those tasks are grouped into occupations. So workers decide, you decide how many tasks go to each worker. And then you put a bunch of workers together into stages. And then you have stages which then make the final good. So there's, in some sense, two levels of fragmentation: how many tasks per worker, which is often studied in macro labor economics, and then how many occupations per stage, and then how many stages for the overall process. I'm only going to talk about the last one, is how many stages, but I would argue that the trade-off between the facility of organizing lots of disparate things weighs against the benefit of having highly specialized either occupations or stages. It works each way. So here's how it goes. How did CT fragment factories? This is about production, not trade, keep in mind. So the graph has euros on the vertical axis and has a number of stages on the horizontal axis. And as we all know in economics, every good thing happens at an intersection or a tangency. And since there's no tangency in this diagram, you can guess where the good stuff happens. Now, this is a problem when this is all online because nobody can hear anybody laugh. Actually, nobody's laughing, but that's probably why we shouldn't tell jokes for simulcast things. All right, so here we go. The downward sloping, that's the marginal benefit of having more stages. In other words, more and more specialized stages. Now, having two stages instead of just one is pretty good, and the marginal benefit declines as you get more and more stages. But the rising curve is the marginal cost of coordinating all these stages. And as you get more and more stages, it gets more and more expensive to add one more because, in essence, it's a n times n minus 1 problem. It gets very complicated. And where those two cross, let's say this is this blue point, is the optimum number of stages in 1990. Now, what ICT did in the beginning is lower the coordination costs, so the upward sloping curve shifts down, and we get more stages. That's the fragmentation version of this. Now, the next chart looks at how IT defragmented factories. So now you start from 1990 at the blue point, which is marked, 2008, which is red, which is also marked, that we already talked through. But now IT reduces the benefit of having many stages because it's putting many processes and occupations into single machines. So now that comes down and we move over to 2025 where we get defragmentation. So that's the idea, CT fragmented, IT defragmented. Next topic. Are you ready? Or am I talking too fast? I'm talking, yeah, the interpreters are going, yes, you are talking too fast. Okay. Okay. I once tried to tell a joke at a conference with simultaneous translation, and it usually doesn't work. But anyways, this time, you know, I told the joke, and then everybody laughed just when they should. So I asked the translator afterwards what happened. No, it was one of my friends in the audience. I asked, well, you know, how did it get translated, this joke? And they said, oh, they didn't translate the joke. It was just the foreigner told a joke, please laugh. There we go. Okay, that was your break, by the way. So now we're going to go on to relocalization. So we're moving from production to trade. Relocalization of industrial intermediates due to IT. So how can we measure delocalization and relocalization, which is a kind of European way of saying offshoring and onshoring? But it's so the delocalization ratio that I'm going to look at is the value of imported intermediates of the whole world over the value of all intermediates used domestically over the whole world. So it's imports as a share of all intermediates used at the global level. So it's a measure of internationalization, not a measure of the production process. And I'm going to call that the global fragmentation ratio. So here's the localization fact. Manufacturing supply chains delocalized, but are now relocalizing. And I like the word relocalizing because they're not just going home, they're also going regionally and concentrating as well. I'll show a graph on that. So here from 1995 up to 2008, there was an internationalization of supply chains. You might call it the global value chain revolution. And then there was a relocalization of sourcing, and that's the delocalization going down. So China matters big time, as I showed you, that this is going on everywhere except China. So here is the changes in the 4 big manufacturing countries: international sourcing, delocalization in the left chart, and relocalization in the right chart. So the left chart looks at from 1995 to 2012. That's when the value chains were expanding. And I'm going to look at Germany, China, Japan, and the US. Those are the 4 bars. And each one has a yellow part, which is more sourcing from the rest of the world. In other words, not from yourself. The green part is more sourcing from China. And the red part is more sourcing from regionally, but not yourself. Now, what you can see, for instance, in Germany, there was a great deal of internationalization of their supply chains, lots of it from the rest of the world, lots of it from China, and lots of it from the other region, which is essentially Europe, but not Germany. China had more from the rest of the world, but the opposite from regionalization and China. In other words, it was moving more of its supply chain to itself. So one of the most massive change in all of global value chains has been that China has repatriated much of their intermediate inputs. That's been a big effect. So for Japan, it looks a lot like Germany, but a bigger dependence on China. For the US, looks like the same thing, but it has not, never fragmented as much. Now the next chart shows the defragmentation phase, and you can see whether it was localization or regionalization or what. So with Germany, you see that there's been a decline in imports from the rest of the world, a decline in imports from the rest of Europe, but actually an increase in imports from China. So China is obvious. Japan, you see there's been an increase from China and an increase from the rest of the region, but a decrease in imports from all the rest of the world. And and US is a small change, but more or less just like Germany. So in essence, there's been a relocalization of supply chains, and that's worldwide, and it's been going on since 2012. Okay, so the localization facts, both final intermediate goods and manufacturing. The blue line is the one you've seen a couple times now. That's intermediate goods, and it's very sharp. But if you look for final goods, that's the orange line, and you see a similar pattern. So this isn't just about supply chains, it's overall both final and supply chains are relocalizing. Okay, so why delocalize and relocalize? I'm going to talk about how the ICT revolution could also affect this one. And these slides are a little bit more complicated, so I'm tempted to just summarize them. We'll see. And the interpreters have asked me not to talk faster, so that's the other way to get through the slides. So why relocalize intermediate goods? Let's focus on the global value chains. So the offshoring internationalizes supply chain. Here's the idea, the economic logic flow. ICT made industrial offshoring feasible, vast wage differences made it profitable, and labor-intensive stages were offshored to emerging economies. And since trade happens when production and consumption are separated, the offshoring of the production led to internationalization of supply chains. So at the bottom, you see two-way trade in intermediate goods. Now, which stages are offshored? So what I'm going to do in this chart, which has euros on the vertical axis and production stages arranged by labor intensity on the horizontal axis. So we'll have the most labor-intensive ones on the left going less and less labor-intensive. So the sort of incentive to move them to low-wage sources decreases as you move from right to left. And then there's a cost of coordinating. And at some point, the cost of coordinating doesn't make up for the saving on production costs. And you say, I'm only going to offshore from A to D. So the trade-off is relative cost of production at home versus offshoring compared to the coordination cost of production at home versus offshore. So stages A through D are cheaper to offshore. Now when ICT gets better and that orange line dips down, you offshore more stages. So that's the idea. CT, as it accelerated, leads to more offshoring. And now we're talking about internationalization, not the production process itself. Now, better IT automates labor out of manufacturing and therefore lowers the benefit of offshoring, leading to relocalization. So here, the blue line, which is essentially the benefit of offshoring, shifts down. So you get less offshored. Now this, I think, is an important development, which many people are not looking at quite closely enough, which is automation of manufacturing will make it jobless and non-traded. The reason things are made far away is because labor costs less. Because remember, you cannot create a comparative advantage on something that's traded. And the one factor of production where there are still enormous price differences is labor. So if you take the labor out of manufacturing, it will be localized. So manufacturing is going to become non-traded and jobless. So good luck with all the countries trying to reindustrialize their base, probably just bringing the robots home. Okay, so why the final goods? I'm going to skip this part because it's not so, it's a little more complicated and basic, the same economics. But I did want to show you I have an equation there, so you know I am an economist. Okay, how and why the service trade ratio did not peak. So this is the other. I should probably tell a joke to punctuate again, but I don't have one that's quick enough. Oh, I know, I have a really quick one. How about this? So there are 3 types of economists in the world. Those who can count and those who can't. Thanks. For those of you online, they didn't laugh either. Okay. So the idea here is, if you look at the right chart, the red shows the increase in trade to GDP ratio and then the decline afterwards. The blue is the same thing for services. And as you can see, although goods trade peaked and is declining, or at least flat, that's not true of services. It has not slowed down at all. It barely even paused. So if nothing else, extrapolation tells you that the future of trade is services, not manufacturing. And I'm going to go through that argument. The left side is my argument of how this thing's going on, the first unbundling, the second unbundling, the third unbundling. The friends and family in the audience will be familiar with those, so I won't go through it. The other ones, it'll take too long to explain, so I'll just skip over that. Just stick with the fact that services to GDP ratio did not peak, goods to ratio did. And I'm going to track down the services a little bit more now. First of all, I'm going to argue why service trade is more important than you think. So first of all, if you look at digitally enabled service exports, which is essentially things you can send over the wire, and those of you who are into the data, it's more or less mode 1 services, but it's stuff you can send over the wire. It's essentially international remote work. It's like working from home when home is abroad. That's what this stuff is. And if you look at the share of all exports, it went from 7% in 1990 to 15% in 2020, and it's continuing to rise. It actually accelerated during COVID. If you look at the share of value added in services, the value added in exports, the service share is already up about half. And the reason is because the value added in $1 of exports of services is much higher than $1 value added in manufacturing. So if you look at the dollar value of services over GDP, it looks smaller, but if you look at the value added in those exports over the value added, it's about half already. And if you look at export-linked jobs using the OECD's trade and employment data set, you can see about 55% of export-related jobs in the G7 are in services, not manufacturing. Okay, so what are digitally enabled services? This left chart, for those of you who don't spend your lives looking at service data, this is kind of a quick run through. This is the WTO data, the internationally coordinated data set. So for all services, it's usually broken up into 3 big groups: transportation, travel, which is essentially tourism, and then digitally enabled services. So just as an aside, this data is terrible. It's very, very poorly reported. In fact, probably I'm exporting services right now because probably somebody has dialed in from abroad, but I guarantee you that's not being reported. Also, I'm not getting paid, so maybe it shouldn't be reported. So digitally enabled service decomposition. If you look at, this is the big orange part. So there's telecoms, computer, and information service. Think about India. Then there's other business services, which is a whole slew of things: translation, fixing up PowerPoint slides, going through CVs, all sorts of back office stuff is in there. It's quite large. Financial services is pretty big. Insurance and pension, which is another type of financial service, is pretty big. Then you have the intellectual property charges like Netflix and stuff like that, and then a bunch of other stuff that's a rounding area. So the growth of these things, if you look at other business services, it's growing very fast and it's very large. If this were goods, they would have broken that down into something, but since it's services, it's just other business services, but it's really growing in importance. So now I just wanted to make the argument that this other commercial services, this digitally enabled services is growing fast, and not every part of it is growing at the same pace. I want to talk a little bit more about that. So first of all, before going into this, I want to ask, what are intermediate services? And this is an important distinction which is widely ignored, or at least sufficiently recognized. If I talk about intermediate goods, you immediately start thinking about brakes and engines and components like that, and you know that's an important thing, especially this audience. But if I talk about intermediate services, you go, what? Because most people, when they think about trade in services, they're thinking about trade in final services. But in fact, most of the trade is in intermediate services. One way to say that is it's business to business, not business to consumers. So intermediate services is business to business, B2B, all service tasks done in service sectors, manufacturing sector, and primary sectors that are not sold to customers. So another way of saying it's basically the back office stuff. For example, tasks done by bookkeepers, forensic accountants, and the list goes on. Now I want to make an argument that the future of trade is services. That's what that stands for, FOTUS, future of trade is services. And I've been singing this song for a long time, so that's how I remember it myself. Many other people have been saying this. So here's my conjecture. The four trends will continue, and therefore the future of trade will be services. 4 facts and a conclusion. First, the barriers to service exports are much higher than goods. And this includes the B2B. So estimates on gravity, for instance, finds that they're hundreds or thousands of times more inhibiting than in goods. So much so that very frequently people just say they're non-traded. The barriers to intermediate exports are technologically linked, not policy linked. All the, for instance, the OECD Trade Service Restrictiveness Index, that's about B2C. And those are incredibly restricted. But the stuff that India made its miracle on, there is no regulation. India did its export miracle in services without signing a single free trade agreement. So there are no barriers. I have a story as to why that's true, but I'm not going to go into it, but it's true. Digital technology is lowering service export barriers exponentially. So if it's 1,000% this year, next year, 2 years, it'll be 500%, then 250, et cetera, et cetera. So the liberalization of trade in intermediate services is proceeding at an exponential pace. Lastly, the demand in rich nations is huge. If you look at gross spending in an economy, something like 1/3 of all gross spending is on intermediate goods. And if you look inside your own organization, where the head count is, it is exactly in the people doing intermediate services. Not so much consumer-facing, it's inside the business. Moreover, the capacity in emerging markets is also huge. People in Bogota, Nairobi, South Africa, they're already doing this for their own companies, very frequently using the same software, very frequently using the same protocols, very often having a training which is either related to French, British, or American training. So this is not something where you have to build a factory or dig a mine. All you have to do is just dial up and dial into a foreign office, and you're exporting. So the idea there is, because of this, this trend will continue, and very soon the future of trade will be dominated by services, even in gross terms. Then let's talk about G7 protectionist pressures and CO2, as we always should. Border protection is very difficult with services. In fact, the reason the service statistics are bad is exactly the reason it's hard to protect, because it's very frequently hard to know it's going on. Value-added tax, in principle, is collected on imported services, but a lot of that is missing because very frequently people are importing services without even knowing they're doing it, and it's paid for by interfirm transfers, which aren't really clearly recorded as service transfers. The regulation, especially privacy, could hinder it, but otherwise very hard. And also, it's worthwhile saying that trade in services is notably less carbon intensive than trade in goods, not just for the transportation, but the entire service sector is less carbon intensive. So it's a good story. So my prediction is we'll expect a global talent tidal wave. When all those engineers graduating in China, underemployed in urban areas, start speaking English through simultaneous speech translation, which is coming, machine translation, using ChatGPT to adapt culturally, there will be a massive input to the world talent system, as there was a massive input to unskilled laborers in the 90s. That wave is, I believe, coming. That's why the title of my second book, Mr. Chairman, did I mention I wrote a book? Yeah. I did, okay, good, okay. It's called The Globotics Upheaval. I don't have a picture of it, but it's called The Globotics Upheaval, Globalization and Robotics. And upheaval is what I think might happen when this global tidal wave washes up on the shore of the G7 countries. Okay, so now I have 4 minutes to do service-led development. So this is a trend which is essentially, what does this mean for emerging economies? And the World Bank is on board with this. Even Danny Roderick has switched his story. He's on board with this. So the emerging economy's share of service exports is low but growing fast. So here, if you look at the modern service exports, this blue part is the developed countries, and India is the gray, China is the orange, for example. But since 2006, the emerging economy exports have been growing faster. So here's another version of that. If we look at particular other business services, professional, technical, administrative services, information and communication, you can see the developed nation services are growing, but those from emerging markets are growing even faster because a lot of this is driven by wage differences. And I did a paper where I looked at Colombia, and we found that Colombia, not a poor country, we matched them with teleworkable occupations, and we found that the US workers were 15 times more expensive. So you're talking about Colombia, where $5 an hour affords you a middle-class living. Selling services into a country where $50 an hour is considered a nice living. That difference is the arbitrage which I believe will drive this forward. Okay, last set of facts. Manufacturing export-led growth is dead or dying. Service-led export growth is thriving. So how do you measure export-led growth? Turns out there is no standard definition. It's the sort of thing everybody knows it, but nobody's managed to define it. So what I did is I just took that the growth of domestic value embodied in exports is bigger than the growth of GDP. And if that's going on, I'm going to call it export-led growth. So the number of emerging economies with service versus industry export-led growth. If you look at from 1995 to 2008, and then from 2008 to 2020, this is the lower middle income countries in the TIVA data set. And you can see, although industry export-led growth was quite common before 2008, it's pretty rare now. And that's also true for the upper middle countries. This is the service-led exports, and you can see both the lower middle and the upper middle, more of them are doing it. So except for countries mostly in this region and Central Europe, All the other countries are doing export-led growth on services, not manufacturing. So it's important to say that this is a different structural transformation, and I think we have to start thinking about it and gathering data on it. So first of all, think service export-led, not industry export-led development. Think India, not China. Think Bangalore's galore. I hope you like that one. What's this going to look like? There'll be a Bangalore in Nairobi. There'll be a Bangalore in Bogota. There'll be a Bangalore in, all over the world, city-led, service-led development. I think we need a new development theory that's not based on backward and forward linkages, as industry is, and it'll probably be an extension of urban growth theory, like Myrdal's model of cumulative causality. So I'm going to skip these last slides because I want to save the time for discussion, and I'll stop right there. Thank you very much.